All right, well, I think we'll get underway. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Katrina Annis-Brown from the Council Engagement Team in the Office of Local Government. Today we are joined by SafeWork New South Wales to discuss managing hazardous chemicals. Speakers will be Patrick Quinn, Principal Inspector, Hazardous Dangerous Goods and Explosives, and Natasha Kreitels, Assistant State Investigator, Hygiene and Toxicology. Just a couple of housekeeping items to note before we start. For this webinar, your cameras are turned off and your microphones have been muted. These can be turned on by our conveners if needed. Closed captions functionality is available. To access this, click on the three dots at the top of your screen. Click on Turn on Live Captions. If the sound or video is breaking up during the webinar, please try exiting the webinar and rejoining. The chat function has been disabled for the webinar. However, the Q&A function is available to ask questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available through the Council portal on the Office of Local Government website in the next few days. Time has been allocated for questions after the presentation, including any questions asked on registration. You can post your questions in the Q&A or ask your questions by raising your hand, and we will enable your camera and microphone at that time. So I now welcome Patrick and Natasha to present the webinar content. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. We good to go? I presume we are. No worries.
Well, good.
Okie doke, guys. My name is Patrick Quinn, and Natasha's also going to be co-presenting. Feel free to ask any questions. If anyone's typing any questions in at the side, I'm probably not going to be able to see them. Well, I'm not going to be able to see them because I've got presenter mode on. If anyone struggles with my accent, I'll try and speak as slowly and as clearly as possible. I have been here a while, so hopefully everyone's used to it. So, guys, this is a presentation that's going to be focused on the hazardous chemicals that are generally encountered in and around the pools and aquatic centres, etc., etc. But before we start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and we also extend that respect to all of the other people present, to all of the First Nations peoples anywhere in the world who are affected or have been affected and continue to be affected by colonisation. And I myself today am presenting from Darragland, which is part of the Eora Nation. So just a quick overview for my part of the presentation. We generally wouldn't see the photo that's on the right in relation to swimming pools, but this is some of the stuff that we do deal with. And we go into various warehouses, various manufacturing plants, various facilities that have got dangerous goods or chemicals present. So this is basically, I'm going to be focusing on sites that have exceeded the placard quantities as prescribed in Schedule 11 of the WHS 2017 legislation. So I'll cover off what exactly that is and what are the requirements are around that. We will also look at the sites that have exceeded not only exceeded the placard quantities, but also the sites that have exceeded the manifest quantities as prescribed in Schedule 11 of WHS 2017 Leg, and any site that uses, handles or stores hazardous chemicals in the workplace. So you may not have reached, I'd imagine most pools would have at least met the placarding quantity, but just in case that you haven't, there are still some requirements around hazardous chemicals in the workplace. I'll get over this pretty quickly. Look, the relevant act is 2017 Act. Specific duties fall under Section 20 to 25. And the Explosives Act, I look after as well, or our team looks after, but probably not relevant to you guys. The relevant regulations in the Work Health and Safety Regulation 2017 is Chapter 7, Chapter 9, Chapter 11, Chapter 12, Chapter 13. Now, these chapters, unlike a lot of legislation, is kind of a bit wordy, and it's it states things like in the opinion of the inspector, etc., etc. If we have to make sure that we've got an opinion on something and that we've got due evidence recording. Not so much when it comes to the dangerous goods and chemicals piece, because Chapter 7, 9, 11, 12 and 13, they're all pretty prescriptive. So it's not an opinion. It's either you do or you don't. So it's if you're got an engineering type background or you don't like grey areas, it's good, because a lot of legislation is very grey. With regards to these chapters, it's either black or it's white. It's fairly quick. So Chapter 7 covers SDS's safety data sheets, the labelling, the hazardous chemical register, placards and manifest, which we'll cover off more so, and it relates specifically to Schedule 11, which is at the back of the regulation, and I'll show you the regulation a little bit later. Notification, Schedule 11 quantities, and Schedule Schedule 15, which is potential major hazardous facilities. So to give you an idea, if you're a Schedule 11 site, you've got a certain number of chemicals on site, and the way I like to explain it to people is, so your service station, for example, in your street or in your town or in your village or wherever you are, a service station generally falls into the Schedule 11 categories. Now, if something goes bump in the night, which it does occasionally, and it can be at a factory or at a service station, you're probably going to affect maybe the street, the surrounding neighbours, the neighbours that back onto the property, etc., etc. So you're going to have an impact on them. So the idea is you put some specific stuff in place to manage the risks, to make sure you've got emergency plans in place, or an ESIP, emergency package, which we will cover later, which goes to Fire and Rescue New South Wales, and managing spills. So that's because it's going to affect the local, very, very local area. If you've exceeded Schedule 15, that means you've gone 10% of the way to being a major hazard facility. Now, there would be there's one or two that in New South Wales that may actually have exceeded that, swimming pools in particular, where you've exceeded 10% of the major hazard facilities. So you can imagine major hazard facilities. If you're a major hazard facility, you are going to be looking at a refinery or something like that. But a lot of the people who were sitting in the Schedule 11 would deliberately sit with their chemicals registered. They would only get to about 90%. Now, the problem with that is 90% means you're just as risky as a major hazard facility, or even 80% in some cases. And if something goes bump in the night at a major hazard facility, it's not just going to affect a couple of streets, it's probably going to affect the whole suburb. And we've seen evidence of that on TV. Normally when there's a Channel 7, Channel 9 or Channel 10 helicopter hovering overhead, and it's it's making the international news. So to stop that occurring, where people would deliberately sit, now if you're a major hazard facility, you've got to have a lot of stuff around you to make sure that you're covering that. To stop people just getting close to that but not exceeding that, and to make sure that we weren't getting the right verification in place, if you get 10% of the way towards a major hazard facility, and that's covered by Schedule 15 under legislation, the legislators decided, hey, you still have to put in a separate notification to SafeWork, and even though you haven't exceeded those quantities, if your site happens to be between a hospital, an aged care centre and a kindergarten, and a school for reformed pyromaniacs, if there is such a thing, your risk may be greater. So we can actually deem you as a major hazard facility, even if you're only sitting at 10, 20 or 30% or exceeded 10%. So that's just a little bit around the legislation. As I mentioned, you've got to be able to make sure you're managing risks, managing spills, and make sure you've submitted an ESIP plan, which you guys are required to do if you've exceeded Schedule 11. And I'll cover all the quantities now in a bit. The ADG classes are class 1 to 9. The ones we're probably looking at are class 3, 4, and 5 in your case. And if so most of these are prescribed in the legislation, and I'll cover that off. Miscellaneous dangerous goods are the bane of my life at the moment, because lithium-ion batteries are sitting in there at the moment, but we don't have quite as prescriptive legislation around that. So what is a placard quantity? So this is Schedule 11, or a piece taken out of Schedule 11, and I'm just using flammable liquids to do this. So a placard quantity is if you've got, in the case of a Category 2, you've got 250 litres. It means you meet a placard quantity. So that means you're going to be required to put a HazChem sign up outside at the entrance to the premises. And that's just to let the fire and rescue know, or anyone know when they're entering the site, hey, particularly in the event of an emergency, if there's a problem, there will be some chemicals in there, but it's only at a placard quantity. And I'll cover manifest quantity off. Now that's specifically called up for in clause 349 and 350 of Schedule 13, which refers back to Schedule 11. It's a bit complicated the way the legislators write legislation. So a good example to use in your case is calcium hypochlorite. Now, where you'll find this information is in the SDS. So you're looking at the safety data sheet for it. But you've got to look under several different categories. So if you look at this, your category 2 for placard quantity of it's an oxidizing solid. It's a category 2. You'll find this information in your safety data sheet, which you're required to have if you've got chemicals on site. Any site that's got chemicals on site, any workplace is required to have the safety data sheet on site for it. But it can be a bit confusing sometimes because you've got two different classifications. So you've got skin corrosion subcategory 1B, which happens to sit down here. Now, both of these are called for in the legislation. The acute oral toxicity, the eye damage, and specific target aren't as specific in the legislation, by the way, but it's there anyway, just so you know. So we don't have these in Schedule 11. But if you look at the placard quantity and the manifest quantity, which is column 4 and column 5 in this, they happen to be the same for in the volume, as in it'll either be in kilos or in litres. But that's not always the case. In some cases, you may have something that is a category 2 as an oxidizing liquid, but under skin corrosion could be category 1. So the quantities, you have to go to whatever the lowest quantity is to meet the requirements. So for example, in this case, it's 250 kilograms as an oxidizing solid. So that's where you have to make sure if you've got more than 250 kilos or 250 litres on site, you've got to have a placard up, and I'll show you what the placard looks like in a minute, and we will get to the manifest quantity as well. Manifest quantity is just the next step to make sure that you've got preparation in place. Skin corrosion in this case is the same, but it may not always be. Like I said, you've got to go to the lowest common denominator. Outer warning placards. This is what we're talking about when you reach a placard site. So Clause 49 says a PCBU undertaking at a workplace must ensure that an outer warning placard is prominently displayed at the workplace if you've exceeded the schedule of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals in the group of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals. It's very wordy. So an outer warning placard must comply with Schedule 13. This sounds very wordy, but I'll click on it now and it'll do that. So this is what the outer warning placard looks like. You've probably seen quite a few of them around. Now, this clause does not apply to workplace if the workplace is a retail outlet and the Schedule 11 hazardous chemical or group of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals is used to refuel a vehicle and is either a flammable gas or a flammable liquid. The reason that there's an exclusion on service stations is the idea of the sign is when you rock up to a sign, the fireys will know, oh, they've got hazardous chemicals inside. We don't need to put a sign on the service station for the fireys to realise there's hazardous chemicals there. By the nature of the business, it's very easily identifiable. The fireys aren't going to go rock up and go, I wonder if there's petrol or LPG gas stored at this site. They're going to know. That's why that odd exclusion is in there. So the regulators actually got it right. So there's a lot of work done on this and we actually got it right. If you're wondering why the specific lettering and the sizing is specifically like that, and it goes for a lot of the chemicals and a lot of the placarding and signage that's used there, it is so that the fireys can read the sign from a distance of 800 meters with their standard issue binoculars. As you can imagine, sometimes they need to be able to see what's on the side of a truck, and that's why the lettering is specifically the size that it is. Placard requirements, Clause 350, requirements to display a PCBU must comply with Schedule 13, which is what's underneath it, and it does not apply to a Schedule 11 hazardous chemical group or schedule hazardous element chemicals if it's in a bulk container, including an IBC that is intended for transport, and the placard is displayed on the container. So basically, that's for anything in transit. So that's covered off. Or if it's a flammable liquid in an underground tank at a retail outlet and is used to refuel a vehicle. And the reason being, underground tanks, it's generally the safest way to store a chemical. The EPA would argue, but there we go. So you've probably seen these signs before on the sides of trucks. These are the signs, these are the dimensions. The dimensions are actually called for in legislation. So that's your standard where I'm hoping you can see my arrow moving around. It's 250 mil square for your class diamond. The smaller ones that are just used, so that's on the external of a building. If you've got a door to go through to get into where your hazardous chemicals is, your class diamond can be smaller. And the idea is as the fireys are about to walk through the door, they'll know that the chemical is right behind that door. And combustible liquid that generally refers to diesel. And there's the size of your lettering and the colouring. 3 types of placards. There's your outer warning placard, should be on the outside of the building or on the outside of the fence line approaching the building. As I said, service stations are excluded. There's your bulk tank placard for combustible liquid and for, in this case, it's a flammable liquid kero. And there's your packaging placard. So if you've got packages inside of the product, that's what it should be, etc., etc. Now, the reason I put this up, this is actually a real live photo. We come across sites like this all the time, and I always find it quite interesting when we go to a site. That's kind of very, very confusing. There's way too many signs on there. The legislation actually says the dangerous goods and HazChem sign has to be separate and has to be obvious. And this kind of is lost in this myriad of signs that's on this. Everybody blames us as health and safety people for the ridiculous amount of signs that are up. I actually personally think the signs don't work and they're the last line of defense if you follow the hierarchy of controls. And my logic tells me that if you're looking at this photo, the most riskiest thing that they've got on site, if size is important, is the speed bump, which is obviously not the case unless it's a horrendous speed bump. Now, I can't see if anyone's got any questions, so I'm hoping someone will interject if anyone's put their hand up if they've got any questions around that.
No, so far you're all good, Patrick.
Great, thank you. Now, manifest quantity. Table 11 calls up the manifest quantity, and I'm just going to go through flammable liquids on this because it's easier to get. So this is also 347, 348 in Schedule 12. So your manifest quantity, if you're thinking about this, let me go back. If you're thinking about this, let's say it's a Category 2 flammable liquid. If you've got 250 litres on site, you've got to put your HazChem sign up. If you have 2,500 litres on site, which some places would surprise, you'd be surprised at the number of places that have exceed this number of flammable liquids. If you exceed 250 litres, you're then a manifest site. You have to register as a manifest site. It's a one-off cost. It's about $250, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that you've got to do, and it's important that everybody does it. And the reason it's important is because our first responders occasionally walk into a problematic area. For example, we had the fireys earlier in the year go to a site that was a bookbinding company, little unit in a very busy street. It just looked like a little garage, little factory unit, and it caught fire. It was a bookbinders. The fireys are going in there. They're hitting it with high pressure hoses. And unbeknownst to the fireys and unbeknownst to us, because there was no signage to say that, there was a pallet of magnesium ribbon. I never knew that magnesium ribbon was used in bookbinding, nor did the fireys. And unfortunately, if anyone's done weird chemistry experiments in school when they were back in chemistry, water and magnesium tend not to mix too well. So when the fiery hit this pallet, which was just cardboard boxes with plastic, hit it with high pressure water, it exploded. And he was quite badly injured. Excuse me. So that's the reason why we have manifest quantities, and that's the reason why it's fairly specific. It's to give the fireys advance warning. Now, when you guys submit a Schedule 11 notification to us, it goes up on our system. The specific requirements you have to have a site map with things, blah, 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 on it, listing what your chemicals are, so on and so forth. A map of the site, where the hydrant system is, where the manifest box is, etc., etc. And the idea is the fireys can actually access our system on their way to it in their vehicle, so they can actually get a bit of advance warning done. So what it does is it speeds up the process and it stops them from having to deal with a major drama while they're doing it. So when it comes to manifest requirement, 347 specifically says, excuse me, a PCBU undertaking at a workplace must, if the quantity of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals or a group of Schedule 11s, now it can be a group, various chemicals, handled or stored at a workplace exceeds the manifest quantity. Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals or group Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals, you must prepare a manifest of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals. You must amend the manifest as soon as practicable. So if your numbers go up or down, you need to amend it. You need to specify the type of quantity of hazardous chemicals or group of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals that must be listed on your manifest. And if there's a significant change in the information, it must be recorded in the manifest. A manifest of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals must comply with Schedule 12, which we can cover off. But it's pretty simple. The list is there, and the person must keep the manifest in a place determined in agreement with the primary emergency services. It's generally a red box. It's generally on the left-hand side of the entry to your site. And the reason it's on the left-hand side is because the driver is in the right hand of the vehicle. His passenger can jump out and open the box. It's got a 003 key, so it's all just about speed. It doesn't have to be on the left-hand side, but it does have to be in a place that's agreed by your local fire services. It must be available for inspection under the Act, and it has to be readily accessible in an emergency services organisation. That's what the cabinet looks like generally. Sometimes they're in a red tube at service stations, and they all have a 003 key, so emergency services can go and access it. I can go and access it because our team has 003 keys. They like to have 2 A3 laminated site scale plans, so A3 laminated. The reason we ask for them laminated is because water gets into the box and they turn to mush, and when the fireys go to use it, they're illegible. The reason they're A3 is because you don't want the fireys having to do what I'm doing at the moment, which is wearing glasses while they're fighting fires. There's nothing worse than someone looking around for. So A3 large, fairly large font. A copy of your manifest of hazardous chemicals and a copy of your emergency plan and an emergency services information package, which is an ESIP. And we will be giving you a link to the New South Wales fire rescue page, and they've actually got a template that you can follow for putting your ESIP together. And you've got to lodge the ESIP with Fire and Rescue New South Wales. And the other piece is, which I'm dealing with at the moment, if they come back to you with a written recommendation, you have to do it. So within reason. If they ask for it in, pink with blue polka dots, it's probably not reasonable. But if they ask for you to say, hey, we think your emergency services package is not quite right, you might need to put an extra spill containment point in, or you need to update your plan, blah, blah, blah. You've got to do it. It is a legislative requirement that if they make a written recommendation, you've got to follow it. The requirements are person, PCBU, regulator given written notice, used or handled or stored in their workplace. So the notice under subclause 1 given immediately after the person knows that a Schedule 11 hazardous chemical or group of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals is first to be used, handled or stored at the workplace, or at least 14 days before the first time you exceed Schedule 11, whichever is earlier. Now, if you haven't done this already and you find out today that you haven't put in your Schedule 11 notification, you're technically in breach, but no one's going to come and beat you over the head with this. This is more about information. There's a lot of people out there who don't realise that they haven't got a schedule in place. If we go to site, we don't go and beat them over the head with a big stick. We generally issue a notice and say, hey, you've got to put in your schedule notification. You've got 2 weeks to do it. here's your requirements, here's some information, we're happy to assist you. Now, if you don't meet the requirements within the 2 weeks or don't apply for an extension, then we start handing out penalties, etc., etc. But this is more about getting people up to speed. And the reason we're doing it is to try and really, I think my reason for working at the moment is to assist Fire and Rescue New South Wales when they get to these sites, because you don't want them to be walking in blind like they did when they went to that bookbinders. And B, immediately after the person knows that there will be a significant change to the risk of using, handling or storing of Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals or groups hazardous chemicals in the workplace, or at least 14 days before that change, whichever is earlier. And item C is repealed. I've no idea what it was because it was repealed before I joined SafeWork. So your manifest requirements will require the name and the ABN of the person conducting the business or undertaking. So ABC, Shire Council, here's our ABN, type of business, it's swimming pool, blah, blah, blah. If the work, or it also applies to your water treatment plants in councils, etc., etc. Your sewage works, they generally have exceeded Schedule 11 and in some cases Schedule 15. If the workplace was previously occupied by somebody else, so that's when you change location. So if you take over the running of a swimming pool, for example, they may have already done a notification. So the notification may be in place. You just need to amend it to make sure that it's still current and up to date with your emergency contact details, etc., etc. D is the activities of the business undertaking that involve using, handling, storage. 11, the manifest prepared by a person conducting the PCBU is under clause 347, and in case of a notice under subclause 2B, details of the change to the manifest. And the most important bit to our New South Wales financiers, you must pay the relevant fee. A person conducting a business or undertaking in a workplace must ensure that the regulator is given written notice as soon as practical after the Schedule 11 hazardous chemicals cease to be used, stored or handled. And I'm sorry if I'm putting everybody asleep. We'll get to the exciting bits later. And the notice under subclause 4 must include information referred to in subclauses 3A, B and D. You don't have to read the clauses. There'll be a package going out as to how you submit Schedule 11 and what's required. And if we ask for further information about the manifest, blah, 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 you must ensure that the information is given to the regulator as soon as practicable. This is why it's important. Now, there is a template that we will be sending you with, which tells you what your manifest looks like. As you can see, it's got the business name, trading as, the address, the date of preparation, the emergency contacts, because that's very important for the fireys to be able to get in contact with emergency contacts. Sometimes they're going to site at like 3 in the morning because something has happened. If hazardous chemicals are stored in bulk, what area they're stored in. So as you can imagine, the manifest can be quite large and some of the sites can be quite large, and we've got areas A, B, C, D, E, etc., etc. Chemicals stored in tanks, and then there's also package stores. So you may have probably bulk storage if you've got IBCs, and also packaged stores area. And the idea obviously is you keep your acids and alkalis separate if humanly possible.
Patrick, if I could just interrupt, we've just had a question.
Sure.
So the question is, are we required by law to have an SDS cabinet on the outside of a building that contains hazchems?
No.
Thank you.
No, but if you've got your red manifest box, which I showed you the photo earlier of, and you've got bulk storage of chemicals, so your hazardous chemical register, you might have bleach or domestos for cleaning the toilet. You might have a 5 litre container of that. You are required to have safety data sheets for all of the stuff that you've got on site. So you might have 30 chemicals on site, yeah? If you've got any bulk storage on site, so if you've got either in excess of 500 litres or 500 kilos on site of a chemical, you do need the safety data sheets for those to be in the manifest. And that kind of makes sense. It means, hey, there's a bulk, you've got a pallet of, sodium hypochlorite in your storeroom, or you've got, an IBC of acid to put in your pool, etc., depending on what your chemicals are. And the fires need to know if you've got bulk. Okay, and if you've got an IBC, you've got it's in excess of 500 litres. They don't really need to know that you've got a litre of bleach under the sink, or that you've got a can of WD-40 in your workshop. Does that make sense? Hoping it does. So that's the answer is yes and no. You just for the bulk store, just for the bulk products. You don't have to have your full register on the outside of the building. Clause 347 of Manifest Hazardous Chemicals. Prepare the manifest, amend if there's a change, comply with Schedule 12, and we'll send you some information to do that. Keep it in an accessible location for emergency services. Red box works really well, and it's available for inspection under the Act. You must be notified if quantities, manifest quantities, are exceeded. Blah blah blah, and we've already covered this off. Now, while I was doing this, I thought I'd try and do a quick check, and I looked at some incidents in pools. So I specifically excluded New South Wales when I was putting this together, because I didn't want to highlight on anyone in case anyone was in the room. And we give this presentation to not just councils, but independent pool owners as well. So via Royal Life Saving, etc. So I looked up and I went pool incidents, chemicals, and the first thing that came up was this, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure how this relates to chemicals, unless the person driving the car had ingested some illegal chemicals. So you've got to be careful when you're doing your Google searches. So that was the first thing that came up, which I went, okay, doesn't relate to what I'm looking for, but it just made me laugh. Now, these are some of the headlines that have come up in various places in relation to pools and chemicals, just specific for chemicals. So what I did was I did a quick bit of analysis on this. Just seeing how I'm going for time. Did a quick bit of analysis to see what was happening of the eight incidents in particular that related to it. It was harder to get the information. It would have been so much easier to use New South Wales ones, but I specifically excluded them for the previous reason. And at least 6 of the incidents were caused by chlorine and acids mixed together, from what I could understand. At least 3 were caused by manual dosing. And if we dug down further, 2 of them were caused by poor labelling. At least 2 were caused by dosing system not being fail-safe. So chemicals injected mixed during a pump failure. So it's very, very, and some of the systems around that we've looked at is if you've got an automatic injection system and it injects, some, product into a line, but the pump isn't running at the time. So the pool pump has failed, but the pumps on your injecting system does not have a fail-safe on it, i.e. it will still ingest it. And then about an hour later, it ingested a second chemical or dosed a second chemical into it. The products were then mixed in the line. 2 products, acids and alkalis, as we know, shouldn't be mixed. And that happened. So have a look at your system or speak to the guy that does your pool maintenance and say, hey, is our system set up that it can't dose one unless we've got the main pump running? Because if it's not, you might need to look at it. And I've spoken to a couple of the pool guys who look after the maintenance and that, they said it's a fairly simple fix in most cases to prevent that from occurring. All 8 of the incidents reported a toxic gas. And I figure none of us or none of the councils or none of the pools, people operating the pools, ever want to get a headline like that in the local paper on the 7, 9, 10 ABC or SBS News. 7 impacted children. 1 was caused by a chemical imbalance. So there was children got sick from a chemical imbalance in the pool. But at least 65 people were treated by medics and 28 were hospitalised. So that was kind of a bit of a learning for us. We're going, wow, this does happen quite frequently. Now, there's been quite a few incidents that's happened in New South Wales, which we've got information on, and it's pretty much the same failings. This is a before and after of what we look like. Believe it or not, these are the same site. This was the example. The one on the left is the example of the drawing as to what the fireys have to look at. As you can imagine. Now, the fireys don't really need to know the contour lines of the site. So the one on the right is what good looks like. So we've debranded it, but the fireys are very, very happy if they get the one on the right. So it shows north, and the reason they need to know north, where north is, on the top left, is that it allows them to take into account prevailing winds, etc., etc. It shows things on here like where the manifest is, which is around here. It shows where the in-ground hydrant points are, which are here, the red dots. It also shows the drainage on site. So keeping in mind, if they're dealing with a fire and it's got chemicals, etc., involved, this is pretty good for them because they can then flick into managing what's going into the local waterways. This is some examples of some compliance before and after. Now, I'm not saying there was anything wrong with the picture on the left where they had the hazmat box right next to those 3 cylinders, but we figured if there was an explosion that the fireys would have to go looking for the hazmat box at least half a mile away. So we did get them to move it to the actual outside of the box. Now, in this case, it's on the right-hand side because they couldn't place it on the left-hand side, but that specifically was agreed to by the fireys. This is an example of pool compliance. This is what it used to look like, and they'd had some issues, and the one on the right is what it looks like afterwards. For when they were getting their truck to fill up. And again, in the event of a hose failure, it was never going to be real good, the one on the left with product running into the ground. This is where your hazardous chemical notification form goes, and we'll provide this and more information. So functions of the form, any amendments, significant change, closure of the record, any abandonment of tanks, all of these go in here. So if you've got underground tanks that you've abandoned, we need to find out about it. It's for new PCBUs, owners, replacements, and they will give you an 8-digit reference number, and then you can follow up on the application of it. And it'll generally have an NDG number, which is notification of dangerous goods for the site. I think that's me at the moment. Does anyone have any questions?
Excellent.
Can't hear you,
I
Natasha.
guess, yeah, I'll take over then. I'll see if I can take control. So I guess I'm from the hygiene and toxicology team, so I look at this from a bit of a different perspective. And a couple of years ago, we started to get a lot of respiratory incidents occurring at pools. So we went out to see what was happening at pools, and that's where this all started. So I guess for context, of the 10 pools we did a pilot study on, 8 of them were at manifest level for their sodium hypochlorite. So that's something to think about if everyone's sitting here. The likelihood is that at least for metro councils, your pools will likely be at manifest. So if you don't think they are, go and check your sodium hypochlorite. Let's see, can I go next? There we go. So these are some of the chemicals that you may or may not have around your pool. And it is probably a good time to go and audit what you have and where you have it stored. One of the worst possible things you could do is to have your acid stored with some of your other chemicals. That's when you're going to get chlorine gas released. So storage is a big issue. And what we were seeing at a lot of the pools we went to is that chemical training isn't fantastic, and there's quite a turnover of staff, particularly young kids coming to be the lifesavers and do some maintenance, and their understanding of HazChems is nearly non-existent. So it's an area where there needs to be some oversight and some auditing regularly to make sure they haven't just moved chemicals because it was more convenient to have them close together or something like that. And that was a problem at a few places. So this has a really slow lag on it. I don't know why it's not going next. Let's see. It's mad at me. So yeah, I guess that's the context. Oh, there we go. So we didn't need to see that one. That's fine. Now I'm going heaps forward. So what you're going to have at the pools is some system of your hazard communication. So the first thing that everyone's going to notice is the signage. It's your placards. It will be on the labeling of the chemicals. So do your staff actually know what these mean? You are going to have both of these at your pool. Can your staff, and it should be anyone that can go into the plant rooms, know what these mean? And that's a very good place to start your training. Can you read the labels? Do you know what they mean? Do you know where to find your safety data sheets? And that's all about hazard communication. So what is the risk? Where is it? How do we fix it if something happens? And your best friend at the pool with such a turnover of staff is going to be safety data sheets that are easy to access, that your staff know how to read. And so this is your safety data sheet, obviously. Section 2, everyone that goes in your plant room should know how to read section 2. That will tell them what the risk is, what they need to do to protect themselves. The rest gets a bit more complicated. It would be good if they could understand the first aid measures and some of the other maintenance measures of their chemicals. So in particular, first aid, handling and storage, and exposure controls. These are the areas you want to focus on when you're auditing your chemicals and assessing whether or not your staff are competent to handle the chemicals at your pool. So safety data sheets, start there after you check your manifest limits. So in terms of health of your staff, and unfortunately at the pools, you have the complex situation that you've got a lot of public and there's a lot of vulnerable public coming to your pools. Do young children come to the pools? People with medical conditions will come for therapy type classes, and all of these demographics are going to be affected by chemical exposure much faster than a healthy middle-aged adult, for example. And that's why you need to be a lot more on top of it because your kids will go down so much faster than anyone else. So you need to, or your staff that are there need to understand how to identify some of the exposure symptoms so that they can quickly address the problem. At a lot of the pool incidents I go to, the risk should have been identified months earlier. They were getting reports of asthma attacks at the pool, respiratory distress, parents taking their children home because they were coughing too much. And it was just ignored. It's just ignored because kids have asthma, kids get sick, they have coughs. Unfortunately, at the pool, lots of respiratory issues is a red flag that something's happening. And it might not be that your chemical dosing is a problem. We have seen at some facilities that you can actually recreate chlorine gas in your balance tanks. So if you have a balance tank that is very confined in space and you've got a lot of water splashing into the balance tank, it's going to displace that air. Now, that air that had been sitting there stale for quite some time, the chlorine has come out of the water and reformed into chlorine gas. And when you displace that air with water, it comes up onto the pool deck. So everyone's heads are about where your scum gutters are. So if you don't have vented balance tanks, which is a problem in pools that used to be outdoor pools that have been converted to indoor pools, it might also be a problem with pools that have water attractions, so water slides, wave pools, things like that, where there's going to be large amounts of water displacing that air frequently. You can get these big gas clouds essentially coming out of your balance tanks onto your pool deck. People might report nausea, vomiting, respiratory symptoms. So these are some of the things you want your lifeguards to be really alert on, and they should be recording medical incidences in your incident register so that you can review it regularly and go, oh, we've had a lot of asthma attacks this week. What's happening? Do we have a chemical leak? Are our balance tanks actually not working properly? They're not vented well or something like that, so that you can do the investigation and make sure you don't end up having your pool shut down because you sent everyone to the hospital. So your lifeguards and some of your senior members of the pool need to be trained in what symptoms to look for. And usually we will encourage, I can see the question there, yeah. minimum training for handling these chemicals. So there isn't a particular course, and we always say that HazChem training should be really specific to the demographic you've got. I would not be encouraging you to enroll your staff in an online HazChem training program where they click through slides and do a quiz at the end, because at the end of the day, they might not have paid any attention whatsoever. What would probably be more helpful with the demographic that you have coming through, particularly young kids that turn over quickly, is more of a toolbox type training where management at the pool take them through the facility, explain the safety data sheet, explain labels, explain storage of the chemicals and all the other controls you have in place. We also really don't count handing all the procedures out to a new employee, getting them to read them and sign that they understood them. That is not training, because they will sign it regardless. Whether they read it and understood it, they will sign it because you've asked them to. So a more practical type training seems to work in this environment, rather than online modules or making them watch a video, although the videos could be helpful if you have an induction. I like to bring up the hierarchy of controls because you should be starting at the top. So your engineering controls are probably where you're managing most of your risk. You've got auto dosing systems, you've got forced ventilation in some facilities, those kinds of things. You've got your admin controls with some of your procedures. We really try not to encourage PPE. However, in the nature of where I work in toxicology, unfortunately, PPE is something we will focus heavily on when we visit you too. So the page is just turning, and I do want to talk briefly about PPE before we finish. So most pools will have some form of respiratory protection. My slideshow does not want to change page. I apologise for that. Here we go. So these are the types of PPE you might have on site. Your respirators, your coveralls, goggles, gloves. Now, most places are good with goggles, gloves, that kind of thing. It's the respiratory protection where everyone seems to fail. And it's because it's not used on a regular basis that the program seems to fall apart. So my recommendation to all pools is to have a written respiratory protection program, because you will have respirators on site. Your program should include some information about maintenance. So how are you cleaning your mask after each use? Now, if you've decided that the masks are only for emergency situations and you don't want everyone to have their own, you need a written cleaning procedure that everyone knows how to do and has been checked on so that you can manage hygiene. We really don't like shared respirators, but I do understand in that context that it might be more beneficial to have one of each size, a small, medium and large, and your workers tested to what size will fit them. So they know if I have to grab a respirator, I get the small. And then I have to clean it when I finish before I store it away again. So you need a procedure for that. They should be stored in airtight containers. So if you keep the respirators hanging on the wall, which nearly every facility will be doing, those filter cartridges you have on there, they don't work anymore. They've been sitting there, and what happens is they have all these binding sites on the cartridge, and they'll just suck in any chemical from the air while they're sitting there not being used. They will continue to fill up even when they're not in use. So if you don't put them in an airtight container, by the time you go back to use it, those cartridges are no good and you need a new filter. So if they are an emergency use situation, we usually say you should be putting a new filter on every time. If they're only for emergencies. If they're for regular maintenance, you can look at having in your procedure a changeover period, whether it's every 3 months or every 6 months. The manufacturer can usually give you an idea based on what work you're doing. And then they should be stored clean. So never put them away dirty, and never hang them on a hook out in the plant room because they're no longer clean. Cartridge selection was another big issue. Nearly every pool I have been to has the wrong cartridge. So most places will sell you a chemical respirator with the standard brown cartridge that you can see on the left. That is an organic vapor cartridge. Chlorine gas is not an organic vapor. It's an inorganic vapor. So you need a B-type filter cartridge, which is the yellow one. Now, it comes in all brands. You can get cartridges with the organic and the inorganic, then the acid mist, and also particulates all in one. So that filter on the far right at the bottom, that has everything in it. So probably a bit overkill at the pool, but that will do your dusts from your perlite, it will do your inorganic gases, it will do your organic gases. So you need to look at what cartridges you've got on your mask. If they're brown filter cartridges, they are the wrong mask. They're not going to provide protection against chlorine. So I'd be recommending getting one of those combined ones, because you will potentially have acid mist if you're dosing with acid. You'll have chlorine. You will likely have particulate dust as well. So that would be my recommendation. And the last thing is, with your respiratory protection program, all masks are not one size fits all. You do need to test your workers to see which mask fits them. Now, a fit test is not a fit check. A fit check is where the worker themselves tests that when they put their mask on, they've got correct pressure and they've tightened it properly. A fit test is done by a technician, and they'll check whether or not the seal around the mask is good and whether or not the worker fits that size. So, for example, I need an extra small 3M, which is super annoying to find off the shelf, but that is just the shape of my face. We have team members that need an extra large, which is also super annoying to find off the shelf. You will have a mix, particularly because you've got staff ranging from teenage right up to a higher age. You will need a mix of mask sizes, and they will need to know what size fits them. Okay, someone has commented that once acid is mixed with chlorine, you need the pink ones. So the pink color is sometimes a generic color for different manufacturers. I would look at the mask you've got and call your manufacturer and ask them exactly what you need, because those colors are we're starting to see that the colors are changing, which is super annoying, because we have always said, get a brown one, get a yellow one. Some of the manufacturers are trying to be different now, so do call your manufacturer. So fit testing, there's a website called respfit.org.au. Has all the information you need about who can do the fit testing, why you need to do it, and how you get that done. So I highly recommend that you start implementing that into your respiratory protection program as well. No, that's not on my. Oh, yeah, I did that one. So here's an example of why we need to do training in respiratory protection. So this lovely policeman thinks he's protecting himself from dust. I'm not sure if you can see, but the nose clip that should be molded around his nose is actually on the side of his face. The other issue with this is he has a beard, and this is going to become an issue for your workers. You cannot have respiratory protection that requires a tight seal around your face if you have any facial hair. That will interrupt that seal. So there are special masks you can get for bearded workers, and we do recommend those in cases where you have cultural reasons where people need a mask. But for the most people, we do suggest a clean shaven policy. You cannot wear a mask with facial hair, basically. In terms of fit testing being legislated, none of the Australian standards, well, very few Australian standards are called up in the regulations anymore. We regulate fit testing under clause 44. Is the respirator a reasonable fit? Now, if you think you can demonstrate to us that the respirator is a reasonable fit without following the Australian standard for respirators, you're welcome to challenge us, but generally we do require fit testing, yes. So here's some examples of people wearing their masks much better. And that's all. Thank you. So if anyone has any other questions, Patrick's still here as well, and we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, you're also welcome to ask them after the fact, and we can always get back to you.
So if there are no more questions at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. The Office of Local Government will upload a recording of the webinar to the events page on the OLG website in the next few days. Thank you, and this concludes the webinar.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.